Have you ever stopped to think that a simple look can carry more meaning than 1,000 words? In some of life's most decisive moments, it's not what is said that transforms us, but what is seen, felt, and understood in silence. And perhaps one of the most intense, profound, and revealing looks in the entire Bible is precisely the one that almost goes unnoticed in the Gospels. Jesus' look at Peter after his denial. What was there in that instant? Accusation? Disappointment? Or something much deeper than we can imagine at first glance? Imagine yourself in this scene. The night is cold. The high priest's courtyard is lit by torches. Shadows dance on the walls. Voices mingle with the metallic sound of soldiers' weapons. Peter is there, restless, trying to warm himself by the fire, while his heart burns with fear and confusion. Just a few hours earlier, he had pledged absolute loyalty. Now, under pressure, he denies knowing Jesus, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And then the rooster crows. At that exact moment, something happens that changes everything. Jesus doesn't shout. He doesn't accuse. He doesn't expose. He simply looks at Peter. The Gospels record this detail briefly, almost discreetly, as if it were just another element of the narrative. But that is precisely where the depth lies. A silent glance, crossing the courtyard, breaking through the noise of the night, meeting the eyes of a broken disciple. What did that look say? What did Peter see there? Shame? Guilt? Or a love that refuses to give up? What you are about to discover may surprise you, because this small gesture reveals a dimension of Jesus' character that many have never explored attentively. This is not just a historical episode involving Jesus and one of the apostles. It is a powerful portrait of how God deals with human frailty. While the world expects explanations, defenses, and formal requests for forgiveness, Jesus responds with presence. A gaze that knows the past, sees the present, and yet believes in the future. A gaze that does not negate the flaw, but also does not reduce Peter to the mistake he made. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever felt seen at your worst moment, when all you expected was condemnation? Within the Bible, especially in the accounts of Jesus and the early Christians, there are gestures, silences, and attitudes that carry hidden teachings, profound spiritual revelations that go beyond words. And Jesus' gaze at Peter is one of those key moments. It happens quickly, without speeches, without explicit theological explanations, but with a force capable of breaking a hardened heart and initiating a process of inner transformation. It is no coincidence that Peter, perceiving that gaze, leaves and weeps bitterly, not because he was humiliated, but because he was understood. Stay with me until the end of this reflection, because understanding this perspective completely changes how we read this episode and, even more so, how we see ourselves before God. This narrative detail reveals a forgiveness that precedes verbal repentance, a mercy that manifests itself even before any request. It's a small scene in words, but gigantic in spiritual meaning. And the more attentively we look at it, the more we realize that perhaps it's not just about Peter, perhaps it's also about us. Now, take a deep breath and mentally return to that courtyard, to the cold of the night and the roosters crowing. Because before any word is spoken, before any restoration takes place, there is a gaze that needs to be understood, and it is precisely from this point that our journey begins. As we walk through this moment, so silent and yet so full of meaning, it's almost impossible not to feel that this story touches something very personal within us. Because deep down, we've all been in some kind of dark courtyard of life, facing our own denials, fears, or internal contradictions. And that's precisely why this gaze of Jesus continues to resonate through the centuries. He doesn't speak only to Peter. He speaks to everyone who recognizes themselves as fragile, human, and in process. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you most so far. Sometimes, putting what we feel into words helps not only to organize our hearts, but also to show others that they are not alone on this journey. When you share your experience, your doubts, or even your silence, you create a space for real communion here on the channel. Each comment is a sign that this message is alive, that this content is not just watched, but felt. And if at any point in this reflection you realize that this topic deserves to reach more hearts, liking the video is a simple but powerful way to help this message go further. It may seem small, but this gesture really makes a difference because it shows that content that speaks of faith, the Bible, Jesus, and inner transformation still matters, still resonates, and still touches lives. And if you feel that this type of reflection helps you to see the Gospels more deeply, to discover those almost hidden details, those gestures and silences of Jesus that reveal teachings that go beyond words, subscribing to the channel is a way to walk together. It's like saying, I want to continue this journey. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who may be exactly needing to hear this message right now, even without knowing it. It's not just about numbers. It's about creating a community of people willing to look at faith with more attention, more sensitivity, and more truth. So, as we continue to delve into this remarkable episode, keep this in mind. Every like, every comment, every subscription is part of this conversation that doesn't end here. It's proof that Jesus' perspective still finds space, still provokes reflection, and still transforms. And now, with that in mind, let's continue to observe more closely what really happens in that silent encounter between Jesus and Peter, because much more is being revealed than meets the eye. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we carefully observe the historical and emotional context of Peter's denial, the meaning of Jesus' gaze expands in an impressive way. Peter was not a distant follower, someone who appeared occasionally on Jesus' journey. He was part of the inner circle, heard teachings that few heard, witnessed miracles that shaped his mentality, lived experiences that completely transformed his worldview. He was impulsive, intense, driven by decisions made more with his heart than with reason. Just hours before the denial, he had stated with conviction that he would be willing to die for Jesus. And yet, on that cold morning, everything crumbled. The situation weighs heavily on him. The fear is real. It's not just about social pressure, but about survival. Following Jesus at that moment meant a concrete risk of imprisonment, torture, and death. Peter isn't in a comfortable theological debate. He's facing an immediate threat. And it's at this point that the narrative becomes even more human. The denial doesn't stem from hatred, but from panic. It doesn't arise from indifference, but from fragility. It's the portrait of someone torn between the love they feel and the paralyzing fear. How many times does this also happen to us, when our deepest convictions clash with the harsh reality of the circumstances? And then comes the look, not a look pierced by judgment, but a look that recognizes precisely that inner conflict. Jesus had already foreseen everything. He wasn't surprised by Peter's fall. Even before it all happened, he said that Peter would deny him, but he also made it clear that he had prayed for him. This detail completely changes the interpretation of the moment. Jesus' look doesn't say, I didn't expect this from you. It says, I knew, and yet I'm here. This is devastating on a deep emotional level because it reveals a hidden truth about the love Jesus offers. A love that knows our flaws before they happen and, even so, doesn't back down. That gaze carries pain, yes, but not the pain of disappointment that you reject. It is the shared pain of those who love and suffer together. Jesus is about to face the cross, abandonment, extreme violence, and yet he finds space to see Peter in that instant. There is no need for words because everything has already been said. Silence becomes the vehicle of a powerful revelation. Jesus' faithfulness does not depend on human constancy. He is not there to expose Peter, but to remind him, even without words, of who he is and who he can still become. Peter understands this immediately. The biblical text says that he remembers Jesus' words and weeps bitterly. It is not the weeping of someone who has been exposed, but of someone who has been reached by a truth deeper than his own guilt. That look provokes an internal impact, a rupture, the beginning of a silent transformation. It is the moment when Peter's self-image collapses and gives way to something new. The I am strong enough mentality crumbles, making room for a truer, more mature dependence. There is something very powerful here for our own journey. We often imagine that God looks at us impatiently when we make mistakes, as if each failure were a negative surprise. But Jesus' gaze at Peter reveals the opposite. He knows our inner workings, our inconsistencies, our unfulfilled promises, and yet he remains. This gaze pierces through denial because it doesn't dwell on it. It goes beyond, reaches the heart, touches the point where transformation truly begins. It's not a gaze that pushes away, it's a gaze that calls back. And perhaps that's precisely what makes this moment so uncomfortable and, at the same time, so liberating. Because being seen this way requires abandoning masks, justifications, and defenses. Pedro doesn't argue, doesn't explain himself, doesn't try to correct the situation there. He simply leaves. The silent encounter has already done everything that needed to be done. Sometimes the greatest change doesn't happen when we speak, but when we are confronted by a love that doesn't give up. A love that doesn't ignore the truth, but also doesn't imprison us in it. This perspective redefines everything. It doesn't conclude Peter's story. On the contrary, it prepares the ground for something greater. The fall is not the end, but part of the process. Denial doesn't cancel the calling. There is a divine pedagogy happening there, invisible to those observing from the outside, but profoundly real for those who live the experience. And it is at this point that the narrative begins to touch not only the biblical past, but our own decisions, our mistakes, and the opportunities for a new beginning that arise when we least expect them. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments a word or short phrase that summarizes what this perspective of Jesus evokes in you. Right? This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's something here that completely challenges how we've been taught to understand guilt, forgiveness, and restoration. When we think about what happened between Jesus and Peter that night, we realize that forgiveness doesn't come after a formal request, a well-constructed explanation, or a public confession. It comes before any word leaves Peter's mouth, before any attempt to justify the mistake, even before an organized verbal repentance. This breaks with the most basic human logic, the one that says we first err, then acknowledge it, then ask for forgiveness, and only then are we accepted back. With Jesus, the order is different, and this inversion changes everything. The look Peter receives is not one that expects something in return. Jesus doesn't wait for a speech, doesn't demand a promise of immediate change, doesn't set conditions. He simply looks, and in that look, forgiveness already exists. This doesn't mean the mistake is ignored, but that it's not the end of the story. There's a hidden truth here, deeply uncomfortable for our meritocratic mentality. Jesus' love isn't triggered by repentance, it's what provokes repentance. Peter doesn't cry to be forgiven. He cries because he has already been reached by a love that didn't back down in the face of his failure. This explains why that crying is so intense. It's not just sadness for the mistake made, it's the impact of realizing that even in the worst moment, when everything seems to crumble, he wasn't discarded. How many times in our own journey do we believe that we need to fix everything before returning? That we need to reorganize ourselves internally, make the right decisions, change our behavior only then to draw closer to God? Jesus' silent gesture dismantles this logic. He approaches first. He welcomes first. He loves first. And only after that does any real process of transformation begin. This detail changes how we understand spirituality. It's not about a system of exchange, but about relationship. The forgiveness Jesus offers is not a reward for future good behavior. It's a revelation of divine character in the present. He sees Peter as someone in crisis, not as a traitor to be discarded. Faithful love manifests itself precisely at the point of greatest fragility. And this generates a profound impact because it takes Peter out of a place of self-sufficiency and puts him in a more truthful position, more aware of his own limitations. There is something liberating about this kind of forgiveness, but also something frightening. Because if love comes before the request, then there is nowhere left to hide. There are no excuses, no bargaining, no control. Pedro cannot negotiate his return. He can only accept. And accepting this kind of love requires courage, because it means facing who we truly are, without masks, without spiritual pretense. It is an invitation to a more honest journey, where transformation is born not from the fear of punishment, but from the experience of being loved even when we fail. This moment reveals important behind-the-scenes aspects of Jesus' pedagogy. He doesn't build disciples through guilt, but through grace. He doesn't mold people through the weight of condemnation, but through the impact of mercy. This doesn't negate responsibility, but it changes the engine of change. Peter doesn't become a different person because he was pressured, but because he was reached. Forgiveness before the request creates space for a deeper, more lasting change, one that springs from within. And perhaps that's why this teaching is so little explored. It confronts our need for control, our tendency to measure value based on performance. It forces us to reconsider how we deal with our own mistakes and the mistakes of others. If love precedes verbal repentance, then restoration begins before the speech, before the explanation, before the promise. It begins in the encounter. It begins in the gaze. It begins in the silence that communicates acceptance without relativizing the truth. Pedro doesn't say anything at that moment, but something inside him has already been reorganized. His mindset begins to change there, in the clash between expectation and reality. He expected disapproval and found mercy. He expected distance and found presence. This contrast is what generates the necessary internal rupture for a new path. It's not a quick or simple process, but it's real. And it only happens because Jesus decides to love before hearing any request. This pattern repeats itself subtly throughout the spiritual journey. Often, the greatest barrier is not the mistake itself, but the belief that we need to earn the reward. Jesus' gaze at Peter dismantles this belief. He shows that the starting point is not perfect repentance, but a true encounter. And when that happens, something begins to stir within, preparing the ground for different choices, more conscious decisions, and a transformation that goes beyond outward behavior. Before continuing with this reflection, write a short sentence in the comments that represents what this idea of forgiveness before asking for it evokes in you. Comment below, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because Jesus' silence at that moment is not empty, it is not absence, it is not omission. It is intentional, full of meaning, almost disconcerting. In a culture marked by honor and shame, where public mistakes demanded public correction, Jesus chooses the opposite path. He does not raise his voice, he does not call Peter by name in front of the others, he does not turn the fall into a spectacle. This silence speaks louder than any reprimand could, because it protects what is still too fragile to be exposed. It's important to understand that Jesus could have acted in many other ways. He had authority, he was right, he even had moral justification to confront Peter right there. The denial happened in front of witnesses, and a fitting correction would have been socially acceptable. But Jesus' method reveals a completely different pedagogy. He understands that there are times when exposure doesn't heal, it only deepens the wound. Silence, in this case, doesn't cover up the mistake, but creates space for the conscience to work without being crushed by the weight of humiliation. This is one of the most revealing behind-the-scenes aspects of how Jesus transforms people. He doesn't restore through emotional violence, he doesn't rebuild through shame, he doesn't educate through fear. Silence becomes a safe environment where Peter can come into contact with the truth without needing to defend himself. There is no need for external confrontation when the internal impact has already been profound enough. The look did what words could not. Silence preserves Peter's dignity at the very moment when it could have been destroyed. There is something very human in this, and at the same time profoundly divine. How many times, when dealing with mistakes, our own or others, do we feel the need to point them out, correct them, explain them, reinforce the flaw, as if the mistake needed to be revisited repeatedly for the lesson to be learned? Jesus shows a different logic. He trusts in the inner process. He trusts that the encounter with truth, when it happens in an environment of love, produces a more lasting transformation than any harsh discourse. Jesus' silence is not passivity, it is a spiritual strategy. Peter doesn't need to hear anything at that moment because he already knows. He knows what he did, he knows what he promised, he knows where he failed. The silence prevents the mistake from becoming a fixed identity. Jesus doesn't label Peter. He doesn't define him by negation. On the contrary, the silence keeps open the possibility of a future. It's as if Jesus were saying, without saying, "This isn't all you are, this doesn't end your journey." This kind of restoration doesn't hurt, doesn't break, doesn't annul. It sustains until the person is ready to rebuild themselves. This pattern appears in various gestures and silences of Jesus throughout the Gospels. He often teaches without speaking, corrects without accusing, confronts without exposing. There is a profound wisdom in this, a hidden truth that challenges our immediate gratification mindset. Not all transformation happens in noise. Some of life's most important decisions are born in silent moments, when we are confronted not by external words, but by what moves within us. Jesus seems to understand this like no one else. Silence also prevents Peter from reacting impulsively. If Jesus had spoken at that moment, Peter might have tried to explain himself, justify himself, minimize the mistake, or even promise something he wasn't yet mature enough to fulfill. Silence cuts off that path. It forces Peter to go through the discomfort without shortcuts. And this discomfort is necessary, not to punish him but to mature him. True change almost always involves a space of silence, where defenses fall and the truth finds a place to take root. There is a profound impact when we realize that God is not in a hurry to correct us, but is committed to restoring us. The pedagogy of silence reveals patience, care, and respect for each person's inner time. Jesus does not treat Peter as a failed project, but as someone in process. He does not accelerate the restoration, does not force repentance, does not demand an immediate response. He creates an environment where transformation can happen organically, truly, and sustainably. This silence also invites us to rethink how we deal with our own mistakes. Perhaps one of the greatest difficulties of the spiritual journey is learning to remain silent without running away, without excessively punishing oneself, without creating narratives of condemnation. Jesus' silence shows that facing the truth doesn't have to be destructive, can be the beginning of something new, can be the turning point where mindset begins to change, where future decisions are made from a more honest place. Pedro leaves that courtyard in silence as well. There is no dialogue, no immediate resolution, no closure to the story. And that is fundamental. The process is only beginning. The silence opens a space that will still be filled by encounters, by questions, by progressive restoration. It doesn't force the wound closed, but prevents it from being contaminated by public shame. This care reveals a divine way of dealing with human frailty, a way that prioritizes healing before correction. And when we observe this carefully, we begin to realize that Jesus' silence is not an absence of action, but action on another level. A deeper, more subtle, more transformative level. It is there, in that seemingly empty space, that something begins to reorganize itself from within, preparing the ground for steps yet to come, for choices yet to be made, for a restoration that doesn't happen all at once, but along the way. Before continuing with this reflection, write in the comments one word that summarizes what this silence of Jesus evokes in you. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we talk about restoration, we almost always imagine a specific moment, a significant conversation, a clear and visible turning point. In Peter's case, many people point directly to the scene by the sea, when Jesus asks him 3 times if he loves him. But there is a hidden truth that completely changes this interpretation. Peter's restoration doesn't begin there. It begins earlier. It begins on that cold night, in that courtyard, in that silent gaze that pierces through denial without destroying the one who has fallen. The subsequent conversation doesn't inaugurate the process. It merely confirms something that was already in motion. Jesus' gaze is not merely a momentary gesture of compassion. It is the starting point of a profound reconstruction. It is there that Peter ceases to be defined by his error and is once again seen by his calling. Jesus doesn't just see what Peter has just done. He sees who Peter is in essence and who he can still become. This changes everything, because true restoration doesn't begin when someone proves they have changed, but when someone is reminded of who they truly are, even amidst failure. This gaze returns to Peter something he had lost at that moment, the possibility of a future. It's important to understand that Jesus doesn't cancel Peter's calling because of his fall. He doesn't revoke promises, doesn't rewrite history, doesn't replace the disciple. His gaze communicates, without words, that the purpose remains. There's a huge difference between correcting a mistake and redefining an identity. Jesus corrects along the way, but never redefines Peter through denial. He sees beyond the moment, beyond the failure, beyond the shame. He sees the fisherman who would become a role model, the leader who would still be born from his own fragility. This detail is fundamental to understanding the logic of divine restoration. Jesus doesn't wait for Peter to rebuild himself before approaching him. He approaches first, sustains the process, and allows the transformation to happen from the inside out. The gaze is the first step in this journey. It's a silent gesture that says, "You still belong, you are still part of it, this isn't over." And when someone who is falling receives this kind of recognition, something profound begins to reorganize itself internally. Pedro leaves that scene broken, but not discarded. He leaves crying, but not without hope, even if you can't yet name it. His gaze plants a seed. There are still no words, no reaffirmed mission, no verbalized forgiveness, but there is already direction. Restoration begins at the deepest level, in that place where future decisions are gestated. It is there that Pedro's mindset begins to change, even without him consciously realizing it. He stops relying on his own strength and begins, albeit confusedly, to depend on something greater. When Jesus later meets him by the sea, that encounter only makes sense because something had already begun before. That dialogue is not a surprise, it's a continuation. It's not a fresh start, it's a deepening. The look prepared the ground for the words. Without that silent moment, the subsequent conversation could sound like a reprimand. With it, the conversation becomes healing. This reveals an important pattern. God rarely begins transformation with what is visible. He begins in the background of the heart. Jesus sees Peter not for the mistake he made, but for the calling that remains active even when everything seems lost. This calling does not depend on immediate performance, but on the faithfulness of the one who calls. That is why the restoration is not rushed. Jesus respects Peter's inner time, allowing him to go through the silence, the pain, the confusion. The gaze does not solve everything at once, but it points the way. It signals that there is something ahead, even when the present is broken. This way of restoring challenges our common way of dealing with failure. We usually wait for proof, quick changes, visible attitudes before trusting again. Jesus reverses this process. He trusts first, sees first, calls first. And this trust generates a profound impact because it forces Peter to decide who he will be from then on. Not through external pressure, but through an internal response. True restoration is not imposed. It is awakened. There is something extremely powerful in this for our own journey. How often do we think we need to arrive ready to be seen again? That we need to resolve everything before approaching? Jesus' perspective shows that the starting point is not perfect correction, but the recognition of the calling that still pulsates, even under the rubble of error. He does not ignore the fall, but refuses to allow it to be the final chapter. Pedro will still stumble at other times, he will still learn, he will still make mistakes, but that look establishes a foundation. He is not restored because he never fails again. He is restored because he learns to move from grace and not from self-sufficiency. The calling remains, and that changes the way he walks. The restoration begins there, discreetly, silently, almost invisible to those observing from the outside, but decisive for everything that comes after. And perhaps that's exactly how many transformation processes begin. Not with grand speeches but with small encounters. Not with immediate answers but with subtle signs that there is still a path. Jesus' gaze at Peter doesn't close the story, it reopens it. He doesn't close the past, but creates space for a future that will still be built step by step, along the journey. Before moving on, write a short sentence in the comments that expresses what this idea of restoration through sight evokes in you. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because everything said so far makes no sense if we remain solely focused on Peter's story. This gaze of Jesus transcends time precisely because it doesn't belong only to the past. It continues to happen in different ways in the lives of those who fail, those who promise more than they can deliver, those who find themselves torn between faith and fear, courage and self-protection. Jesus' gaze didn't remain in the courtyard that night. It has accompanied the human journey ever since, silent, firm, and present. When we bring this episode into our own reality, we realize how easy it is to confuse Jesus' gaze with judgment. Often we project onto him the gaze we ourselves cast upon our mistakes. A harsh, impatient, accusatory gaze. A gaze that demands explanations, that requires performance, that measures value based on wrong decisions. But the gospel shows something completely different. Jesus' gaze does not paralyze. It calls. It does not push away. It invites return. It does not fixate on the error. It points to a path beyond it. How many times, when we make a mistake, is our first reaction to withdraw, to create distance, to silence prayer, to avoid anything that reminds us of faith, spirituality, or commitment? Not because we stop believing, but because we believe too much in the idea that failure disqualifies us. Peter could have run away forever. He could have disappeared from history, convinced that he had crossed a point of no return. But Jesus' gaze prevents this. He doesn't pursue Peter, doesn't embarrass him, but also doesn't abandon him. He makes himself present in a way that doesn't oppress, but also doesn't ignore. That look continues to say today what it said that night. I know who you are, I know what you did, and yet I didn't give up. This is a hidden truth that transforms mindsets, because it changes the starting point of our relationship with God. Instead of starting with guilt, we start with encounter. Instead of starting with performance, we start with grace. This alters decisions, redefines priorities, and changes how we navigate our own falls. There is something profoundly liberating in realizing that Jesus is not surprised by our failures. This doesn't mean they don't matter, but that they don't have the power to end the story. Jesus' gaze reaches those who fall, not to say it was predictable, but to say there is still a way, and this awareness changes the way we move forward. We no longer walk trying to prove something, but responding to something that has already been given. Perhaps one of the greatest impacts of this perspective is that it brings us back to ourselves. When we make mistakes, we often lose clarity about who we are. We become trapped by the last bad decision, the last stumble, the last denial. Jesus looks at Peter and reminds him, without words, that he is more than that moment. This perspective restores identity even before behavior. And this is fundamental because lasting change doesn't happen when we try to act differently without knowing who we are, but when we rediscover who we are and, from that point on, begin to act differently. In practice, this gaze confronts us with an uncomfortable question. What do we do when we are seen this way? Because accepting this kind of love requires vulnerability. It's easier to deal with rules than with grace. Rules allow control. Grace demands surrender. Jesus' gaze doesn't offer a list of immediate demands. It offers presence. And this presence compels us to decide whether we will continue running away or whether we will allow this encounter to transform us. Throughout the journey, this gaze manifests itself in subtle ways. Sometimes it comes as an unexpected memory, a word that touches deeply, a silence that disturbs, a truth that emerges when we try to distract ourselves. It is not a gaze that pressures, but neither is it indifferent. It accompanies, observes, waits. And this waiting is not passive. It is full of intention, patience, and trust in the process. How many decisions could be different if we stopped interpreting Jesus' gaze as automatic disapproval? How many journeys of faith would not be interrupted if we understood that falling doesn't mean being discarded? The invitation this gaze offers is simple yet profound: return. Don't return when you're strong, return as you are. Don't return with ready-made answers. Return with an open heart. Don't return after you've fixed yourself, return to be restored. This perspective also teaches us to look at others differently. If Jesus doesn't reduce Peter to his worst moment, perhaps that says something about how we deal with the failings of others. Perhaps the transformation we seek in the world begins when we learn to sustain processes, instead of rushing to judgment. Jesus' gaze creates space for growth, not exclusion. He points to a different way of walking, more human, more truthful, more aligned with the heart of the gospel. And ultimately, the question that keeps echoing is this: how many times do we confuse Jesus' gaze with judgment, when in reality it is an invitation to return? A silent, patient, firm invitation. An invitation that doesn't ignore the truth, but also doesn't use it as a weapon. An invitation that doesn't force immediate answers, but opens paths. This gaze remains active, traversing our falls, our doubts, our contradictions, waiting for the moment when we will realize that it never ceased to be there. Write a short sentence in the comments that summarizes what this look means to you today. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." If you've made it this far, it's because this gaze, this silence, and this story touched something within you. And that says a lot. This type of content only makes sense because there are people on the other side willing to reflect, to look more calmly at the Gospels, and to walk more deeply on this journey. So, if this message spoke to you in some way, if it connected with your story or with some moment you are experiencing now, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue this conversation. The idea here is precisely this: to explore gestures, silences, and attitudes of Jesus that often go unnoticed, but have a real impact on our lives. If you'd like, you can also leave a comment saying you watched until the end. You can write something like, "This message was for me," or "I'm with you until the end." This helps create a space for exchange, for community, where we realize we're not walking alone. And if, throughout the video, you felt a genuine connection, Leaving a like is a simple way to show that and help this content reach more people who might need exactly this reflection right now. And before you leave, there's a video here that perfectly complements everything we've discussed today. Click on it and continue with me there. The journey continues, step by step, with the same attentive gaze towards what Jesus still wants to reveal.